back in 2011, I want to look at this from our perspective in Belfast City Council, because we've been referred to a little bit already today. But in terms of looking at the impending decade and councillors in Belfast City Council at the time, looking at how are we going to navigate our way through this, the council set up what was called a Historic Centenaries Working Group. And in 2011, that group agreed to a set of principles under which all Decade of Centenaries activity would be undertaken. A list of those key events from 100 years ago that would be marked. So we looked at the chronology. We looked at also as well, agreed to a variety of methods through which events could be marked. And then we looked at looking at the decade in a phased approach. Now, sorry about all the words on the screen, but this is the text of what was agreed. And Paul is right. At that Historic Centenaries Working Group, the members took the HLF CRC principles and looked at how can we adapt them into our own setting and for our own purposes within the Belfast context. And I've just put up the dates there because it's important to look at the process around political agreement around these things. So the Historic Centenaries Working Group reported into the main council committee called Strategic Policy and Resources. And then whatever they agree goes then to be ratified by full council. So by November 2011, before the onset of the decade, this is the text that was agreed, that the decade in question marks a number of significant dates and events that have shaped the history of Northern Ireland and therefore our own identities and cultures. The marking of these events provides the council with an excellent opportunity to broaden our understanding of the past and our respect for the complexity of our shared history. As a shared city in the 21st century, we should be able to deal with difference in a positive and constructive manner, demonstrating openness on the basis of shared civic values within a democracy and a mature respect for cultural diversity within our heritage. So these were the principles that followed on from that. Events supported by the council should provide opportunities to include a range of different perspectives and ideologies rather than a single viewpoint, aiming to increase understanding and appreciation of other perspectives and identities. They should be based on historical accuracy, robust academic expertise, and contain analysis. Engagement with universities, museums, libraries, prony, etc. was essential to ensure this evidence base. That this interpretation of events should be in a broad historical context and understanding of the national and European setting at the time. The council should develop strong links with other institutions, and partly to ensure that there was no duplication and that events and programs were complementary. That we would provide support and for a range of different types of events, from lectures, discussions, debates, to films, drama, activities that attract schools and children, families, etc., so that events can not only be educational, but participative, creative, and enjoyable. And we will provide support events and activities that are not exclusive, but are welcoming to all sections of our increasingly diverse community in Belfast, and that this set of principles should be applied corporately to any key anniversaries being marked by the council. So starting off, we did it in 3 phases, and the first phase was 12 to 14, which we called Shared History, Different Allegiances. And so we were able to develop events as a sort of a program of events in a package under those principles that were agreed. So we were able to do activity on the Balmoral Review, the Home Rule Crisis, the Ulster Covenant, the Gaelic Revival, the Suffragette Movement, the Labour Movement, and then the formation of the YCV, UVF, and the Irish Volunteers in that period. And so there was a series of events done on each of those topics. And then, as was mentioned earlier on, the whole work of exhibitions. And so this was the exhibition that captured all of those themes and topics into one space. And one of the really exciting parts of that particular exhibition was where you could type in a name into an iPad, which was embedded into the exhibition, and you were able to find out who signed the Covenant in 1912 and the Declaration, the Women's Declaration in 1912. So you had people from all over the place coming in to City Hall, typing in the name of a great-grandparent or a grandparent and finding out a little bit about them. So again, it was all about bringing that sort of history to life, but all done within a shared context underneath those principles. So as you can see there, that exhibition contained a number of different perspectives based on historical accuracy. And we worked a lot in partnership with many of many organizations and institutions and individuals and historians and academics to develop that. Leading up to 2016, as we were entering into the second phase, very conscious that marking 2016 was going to be one of the most significant years in the whole decade. When I was writing this, I was going to say one of the most difficult, but in fact, the way things turned out in the end, it ended up being significant rather than difficult. We had developed a program that people seemed to be comfortable with, and councillors wanted to continue with this spirit of respect, openness, and inclusion around what had been generated through the work in the first decade, in the first phase of the decade. So in advance of 2016, we took a cross-party group of councillors to Dublin to look at what people in Dublin were planning for the 1916 commemorations. And through this visit, we learned a lot. We went to the Garden of Remembrance, the GPO, Island Bridge, Glasnevin. And after this, we had a conversation on the bus on the way home with our politicians. And one of the things then that we looked at afterwards in a follow-up conversation was, and again, there was a little bit of, and I know Paul referred to this earlier on as well, about looking at reviving or reviewing the principles at that stage. And what our councillor said was they were very happy with how the principles had served us up until then. But looking at 2016, they wanted us to add 3 key elements to the principles that we had already been delivering activity under. And these were that events and activities should have a strong Belfast focus, that we should use the events to explore the commonality of loss on all sides. And the final one was that all commemorative activity should be respectful. And I suppose that sort of goes without saying, but coming, I suppose, in the political context which we were living in at that time, 2014, 15, 16, I think it was important that elected members wanted to say that, look, anything that we do here should be respectful. So these additional elements were added into our original principles at this point in the decade. And then that phase 2, we developed a program. Again, we had moved on from the Historic Centenaries Working Group into what was then called the Diversity Working Group. And so that was made up of representatives of all of the political parties in council. So we developed a program in partnership with them, and we came up with these particular key elements to the program, which were World War I, the Battle of the Somme, the Easter Rising, Jutland, the changing role of women, including life on the home front during the First World War. And I just thought we developed an exhibition on that too, which was captured. All of the themes of the phase were captured in the exhibition, and 3 little slides here for me represent what the exhibition was all about. So Winifred Carney and George McBride were 2 key people in this particular phase in the decade. George McBride in the Battle of the Somme and Winifred Carney in the Easter Rising. And we had a fella from Chicago in America, Ohio in America, contact us and said, if you're doing anything around this 100th anniversary, I have the original medals of Winifred Carney and George McBride that I bought a number of years ago, and I would like to loan them to you to be put on display, if that's okay. So we jumped at it. He was originally from Drogheda. Conor Dullican was his name, to give him due credit. We had the medals on display for the period of that exhibition. We also then had this as our feedback postcard. So one of the parts of the exhibition was a World War I soldier, and he had a rucksack, and in his rucksack was a little slot that you could go up and write your feedback about the exhibition, tell us what you thought, and put it into the wee soldier's rucksack. And people just loved that. And that's it's based on an original postcard that was sent home from First World War. And one of the most fascinating stories that I heard, which really, again, represented the complexity of the whole period, was, and Eamon referred to him earlier on, was Jim Mitchell. So Jim Mitchell, who wrote a letter home, he'd arrived in Dublin to enlist with the army, and he gave an eyewitness account of the Easter Rising from his room in the Gresham Hotel, where he was waiting to go down on Tuesday morning to enlist with the army. And that's his handwritten letter. And again, a guy from Belfast coming down to Dublin to join the army, observing the Easter Rising happening before his eyes. So we were able to capture all of this in that second exhibition. And I just wanted to give two examples of what I feel, and I know we've talked about the role of Stormont and the Assembly in terms of all of this, but I was very conscious that our elected members in Belfast City Council had done such a fantastic job in terms of enabling the decades to happen and the commemorations and the events to happen in the way that they did. And these two examples for me are really important to note. So in July 2016, the Deputy Lord Mayor at the time, Councillor Mary Ellen Campbell from Sinn Féin, she launched the exhibition, which was called Fields of Battle, Lands of Peace, which you might remember was in the grounds of City Hall. It told the story of the battlefields from World War I, from the landscapes as they are today. And for the Deputy Mayor, it was important for her to lend her support to this project. But after the launch, she spoke about her own grandfather who had fought at the Battle of the Somme. Rifleman, and I told her I would try and keep his memory alive for her. Rifleman Edward Campbell was in the 11th Battalion of the Royal Irish Rifles, and he fought at the Battle of the Somme. When he returned to Belfast, he worked in Hall's Brush factory until his sudden death on the 27th of August, 1940. As a Sinn Féin mayor, Councillor Campbell felt that this personal story of hers represented a really positive and good example of the complexity of our individual and yet collective and shared histories. And then what she did was she hung a photograph of her grandfather in the Deputy Mayor's office in City Hall for the remainder of her term. And a second, and that's actually an Irish News article from the exhibition that was in the City Hall that we're talking about here, that was carried very positively in the Irish News. And then Alderman Brian Kingston, who was the then Lord Mayor, gave a speech to a conference that we did in November of 2016, which we were sort of just using a conference to sort of sum up the year. But in his review of the year where he spoke, he specifically acknowledged the significance of the Easter Rising for nationalists in general, but particularly in Belfast. And what he also did was he, because it was a big part of our exhibition, he highlighted the role of women from Belfast in the events in Dublin in 1916. And I sort of just say this because these public words from civic leaders in a public platform were very indicative of the inclusive nature of our commemorations and demonstrated in the positive environment that had been created for our events and activities. So then when we went into phase 3, we decided not to do an exhibition. And that was mainly due to an issue around, I suppose, financial. But what we did instead was we created a number of themes that our diversity working group again agreed on, which included end of World War I, post-war Belfast, European context, women in politics, the Representation of the People's Act, first woman MP elected, and a particular one, the role of women in the trade union movement at the time, Spanish flu and its impact on Belfast. And then looking at politics and parliaments, and Eamon mentioned the Irish Convention of 1918, which met in City Hall in Belfast, and we did a reenactment of that on the exact day 100 years after. We did then violence, conflict, militarization and displacement. We had planned a conference which was cancelled due to COVID, but we did an online conference, and there's about 4 hours of really good material there, which is online. And then the King's Speech, which was mentioned, the opening of the Parliament in City Hall, and then the impact of partition on Ulster nationalists and Southern Unionists. We have an event tomorrow on that. But I wanted to highlight as well, and this is probably something that we may only dwell on later on in when we look back on this, but delivering events in COVID times, because many of the events in the final phase of the decade were delivered online, particularly over the last 2 years, and Eamon's alluded to that as well. One of the things that I found for us in the council was that it actually increased our participation at events. And again, I wanted to just put these out there if people wanted to view them. So we did a big conference in November 2020, but it was a recorded event. It wasn't a live event, but we've managed to record everything, and it's all logged there. Schools are very interested in this stuff now because it's part of the curriculum. We did a panel discussion, 100 Years of Northern Ireland, How Has It Gone?, which was watched from people, as Jacqueline said at the outset, people from Norway and America were logging into an event that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to provide access to. that's on YouTube. Very interesting debate on that. And then I wanted to highlight as well the role of the Shared History Fund and the projects, because again, our principles were a big part of the application for that project. Because the Shared History Fund and the work of the National Heritage Fund was really about trying to create that shared environment for events around 2021 to happen. And again, these included the commissioning of the drama King George's Speech, which again can be viewed on YouTube, only until June though, because we only secured the Pathé rights that are included in that for 1 year. We also, with Niall and the Nerve Centre, created a 1921 digital artifacts and stories trail, which again, young people and students and schools are really interested in. We did a Lord Mayor's time capsule where we buried a load of items, which included a face mask, a Northern Ireland women's football jersey that was signed, an iPhone, and a few other things representing 2021, looking at that as the 100th anniversary of 1921. And then we did a conservation and restoration project on the 2 royal chairs that were used, that sit in the City Hall Council chamber, but that were used during the inauguration of the Northern Ireland Parliament back in 1921. And that's the time capsule. And there's the 2 chairs. And we did a fantastic event, which was live streamed. Again, I think hundreds of people tuned in that night. If we had had that in City Hall, it would have been very difficult to have that many people involved. But again, there were 10 people in the City Hall, hundreds of people watching online. And final slide for me, the benefits of the principles. So, and I think this is the key, and this is where our elected members really do deserve a lot of kudos for how we've navigated our way through the decade. For the council, I think the principles were the crucial element in our ability to deliver what we've been able to deliver. They were agreed at the outset by all of the political parties in council and then added to in advance of 2016. They were applied to all activity that the council delivered, as well as applying to groups who wish to use council venues such as City Hall for their own events, of which there are many, and the Fellowship of the Museums, the East End Great War Society, the Union of Centenaries Committee, who used City Hall for events, all did them under the principles. I think as well that the principles provided an assurance to councillors that any and all activity was being delivered within the remit of the principles. They enabled councillors then to agree to events that may be perceived as to be important for the other community to be undertaken, mainly because of the safeguard of the principles, which ensured that events would contain fact and balance. And I think it also took the in-the-moment politics out of programmes because of the agreement back in 2011 to run our programmes under these principles. And also as well, I think it assisted our councillors to be generous in the diversity of events that was achieved within all of our programmes.